Good morning. I've mentioned before that after my freshman year in college, I lived in San Francisco for the summer and took some class up there. I love the experience. It's an amazing city. The geography and the diversity and the everything about San Francisco is interesting to me. I enjoyed it. While I was there, I took two classes. One was called Writer in the City, and the second was called The Urban Mission of the Church. And the purpose of this class was to look at the church and ministry in San Francisco and to see how God was moving and how the church was addressing the needs of San Francisco. And so it's kind of cool because we experienced the church in San Francisco, and then in our writing class, we're able to write about it. And during one of the weeks of this class, Urban Mission of the Church, we went to an organization that served the homeless population of San Francisco, and we talked with the director of this organization. It was an incredible experience. This man had an amazing story. He was about 60 years old, and when he was in his 30s, he started a company that became worth millions. He had everything he could want. He traveled, he had vacations, he did everything he wanted, he had everything he wanted. And by his early 40s, his wife got sick with cancer and died. And this devastated the man. And he realized that everything he had couldn't stop the death of his wife. And he had this transformative experience where he came to know Jesus and began to follow Jesus. And in this process of giving his life over to Christ, he took everything he had and sold it down to one suitcase. And he got on the train in San Francisco, got off in Union Square, and lived on the streets. He just felt like Jesus was calling him to leave all of his possessions behind and live a different kind of life. He had adult children at the time, and because he traveled so often, they were used to not seeing him. And so I said to him, "What did your children say during this time?" And he said, "I told them I was on vacation." And so he lived on the streets. He was urinated on, beaten up, had his things stolen, was constantly woken up in the middle of the night. It was a terrible and yet transformative experience. After living on the streets for about 7 months, he finally saved up enough to get a little studio on the outskirts of San Francisco, and he became involved with a homeless organization that had helped him. And eventually he went on to become the president of this organization, which he was when we had a chance to meet with him. When I was talking with him, I asked him, "What was the most important thing that you learned? What did you experience on the streets that you could share with us today?" And he said, "I learned that when you live on the streets, you become invisible to the people and to the world around you." In our story today, Jesus tells a parable about a beggar who lives on the streets in front of the gate of a rich man. At first, they live near each other, but then they both die, and it's their eternal destinies that Jesus wants to touch on, and that we'll touch on today in our lesson. If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 16, verse 19, where we're going to read the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. In verse 19, Luke begins by saying this: "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. And so he called to him, 'Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire.' But Abraham replied, 'Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, but Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us.' He answered, 'Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family. For I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will also not come to this place of torment.' And Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but as someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." And he said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." You think he's hinting at anything there? And what a story, right? And there's so much to unpack in this story. If I didn't know better, I would think this was like a Halloween story or like some horror story. There's all sorts of dark and mysterious images in this parable. And so in order for us to get the most out of this parable, I think it's best to read it in light of the contrasting details between the rich man and Lazarus, organized into 3 sections: while they're alive, their death, and after death. So let's begin with the first section of our parable, before death. In this section, Jesus begins by saying that there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. Must be nice, right? Right off the bat, we're introduced to the rich man who's living a life of luxury. Purple dye was produced in the region of Tyre at this time period, and it was made by crushing these special shellfish. They were called murex shellfish, and then extracting the dye. Some scholars have estimated that it would take about 10,000 shellfish to produce 1 gram of dye. All right, so this was an incredibly laborious process. So right off the bat, we're introduced to a man who's dressed in purple. He has money to throw away. He's dressed in fine linen, and not only for special occasions, but he lives in this clothing every day. The term for luxury here was described by one commentator like this. He said that the term for luxury could be defined as sumptuous frivolity. Isn't that a great word, great term? Sumptuous frivolity. In other words, this man is drowning in luxury. Everything he does is in excess. On the other hand, we're introduced to the poor beggar. Jesus goes on to say in verse 20, "At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, who was covered in sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores." So we're introduced to the rich man, and now we're introduced to the beggar. Not only is he poor, he's crippled, right? Jesus says that the dogs come and lick his sores. I want you to imagine the scene for a minute. This is a man who's likely covered in dirt and dust. His clothes are torn, and he's got some sort of skin condition. He's got open wounds, blood and pus oozing, scabs that are falling off his body. And then a pack of wild dogs comes by, and they say, "Oh, this is a good-looking treat." And they lick the pus and blood and scabs off his body. Pretty gross, right? Yeah, I don't even like to say it, but that's what Jesus is portraying here. That this man is living in utter poverty. He's been overlooked by everyone except the wild dogs. Not only is he dirty in a physical sense, he's unclean in a spiritual sense. If you remember, in the Old Testament, bodily fluids like blood and pus made someone ritually unclean. And so here's this man, he's living in the streets, and he's been forgotten by both the world around him and by his God. In every single way, this man is living on the fringes of society, marginalized by the world in which he's living in. By all first century standards, this man's life is a train wreck. A later rabbinical proverb said this, "There are 3 types of men whose life is no life. He who depends on the table of another, he who's ruled by his wife, and he whose body is burdened with suffering." In other words, this man has 2 out of 3 things that make his life worth absolutely nothing. He's dependent on the food of his master's table. He's begging for scraps, and his body is giving out on him. He was subhuman. He was worthless. And yet, there's one more contrast in this section while they're still alive, which is worth noting, something that hints at his inherent value, and that's this. Did you notice who was named in this parable? Right? It was the poor man, right? The beggar is named. The beggar is given a name of Lazarus, while the rich man is left in obscurity. This is the only parable in the Gospels in which one of the characters is named. and yet it's the poor man who sleeps at the gate of the rich man. In this parable, Jesus chooses to name Lazarus, and he leaves the rich man anonymous. Why? Well, I think he does this for two reasons. The first is that he wants his audience to identify with the rich man. He doesn't give him a name because he wants to have his audience insert their own names. At this point in his ministry, Jesus is feuding with the what do you call them? The religious elite. The Pharisees, thank you. All sorts of P words going through my head. I couldn't think of Pharisee. He's feuding with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the people of honor in their society. They're people who live in sumptuous frivolity, right? They buy fine clothes. They eat meals with people of honor. And so he's feuding with these people. And so he takes the rich man and he doesn't give him a name. He wants the Pharisees and the religious elite to identify with the rich man. And I think for our case today, he wants us to identify with the rich man. On the other hand, he gives Lazarus a name. Why? Because he wants to personalize him. He wants the people that he's speaking to understand that the poor beggar on the street isn't just this sort of nameless, obscure animal in the streets, that he's someone's son, that he's someone's brother, that he's someone who grew up with girls that he liked and future hopes and dreams for his life. That Lazarus was someone who had a future, and yet his life has devolved into this poverty and chaos. Like the person I spoke to in San Francisco, Jesus wanted his audience to understand this man wasn't invisible. And yet when Jesus tells this parable, he humanizes Lazarus by giving him a name. He's important. He has purpose and relevance, despite what the world thinks about him. This is made clear in the next section of Jesus' story, section 2 of our passage, which is them in death. Jesus goes on to say in verse 22, "The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried." Catch the contrast there? The man whom the world has forgotten dies and is carried to Abraham by angels. I mean, isn't that a beautiful image? If I'm going to die, that's the way I want to go. I want angels to sweep me up and carry me to Jesus. And yet, when the rich man dies, what happens to him? He dies in obscurity, right? When the rich man dies, he's simply buried. In the first century, a rich person had friends that would care for his body afterwards. A rich man would have paid for an elaborate tomb and burial ceremonies. A rich man would have had people who would have taken care of his affairs. And yet this rich man, he simply dies and he's buried. And what's interesting is when the man is taken to Abraham, the beggar, Lazarus, it says that he was taken to Abraham's side. Now the Greek term here actually means literally into Abraham's bosom. And this is kind of an old term. If you read an older version like the King James Version, they probably use that term. To Abraham's bosom. And the idea was that the poor man was brought into intimacy with Father Abraham. It's this image of a banquet feast. See, in the first century in Israel, they didn't eat around a table with chairs. They reclined on pillows. So if this were the table, it might only be a foot or two off the ground, and I would have cushions next to me. And the people of honor at my feast would be to my right and my left. So you can imagine, you're kind of laying on your cushions. You don't want your dirty feet to be in their face. So you kind of curl your feet back, and the person next to you lays right here. And the idea is that the person of honor eats at your banquet with their head in your bosom. Kind of an intimate image of love. And so in this image, the poor man is carried to heaven by angels to rest in the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man is simply buried. In John chapter 13, verse 23, we see a similar term used. It says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And there's this idea that the disciple whom Jesus loved is resting intimately with Christ at the dinner table. See, the picture that Jesus is painting here is one in which the poor beggar Lazarus is now feasting with Abraham, reclining at the banquet table, which is every Jew's dream. I mean, the Pharisees would have been sitting there listening to it thinking, oh man, this is what is in my destiny, right? I'm a teacher of the law. I'm going to be reclining in the place of honor. And yet Jesus turns it around and he takes the person of honor, the person who would have gotten all the attention and respect in life, and that man is dead and buried. And the man who's been overlooked, the man who lives in poverty, the man who the world has forgotten and who believes that God has forgotten, is reclining in Abraham's bosom at the banquet table. We actually have stories from first century Jews in which faithful Jews are ascending to heaven and enjoying the messianic banquet with Abraham. And so Jesus takes this and he flips it on its head while the rich man is dead and buried. I mean, you could imagine how the Pharisees would have responded to this type of teaching. The contrast that Jesus is drawing. It wouldn't have made sense in their first century context in their minds. I mean, you could just imagine the words that would have been spoken at this rich man's funeral. He was an important man, right? He made a big impact. Look at what he did in his life. Look at how much he accomplished. No one will ever forget him. And yet, as soon as he's gone, his legacy fades into obscurity. I think we would be wise to live our lives like this, right? How often do we get caught up in the things of this world? How often do we store up treasures and find peace in the security that we think it offers? And yet in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man discovers that the pleasures that he had indulged in on earth have passed away, and all he has left is an eternity of torment. Which brings us to our third and final section of our parable, and that's after death. See, in life, the rich man is king. In life, the rich man has everything. And yet after death, the rich man suffers. Jesus goes on to say in verse 23, in Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. You notice how he's still ordering Lazarus around, even in the afterlife? Tell that man to go get me something and bring him back. And Abraham isn't having it. Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he's comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to here. All right, so in order for us to really appreciate what Jesus is saying here, we've got to focus on the contrast. And I'm going to challenge you to think about who you are in this parable. Are you Lazarus or are you the rich man? Where would you fit into this storyline? And so I'm going to go through rapid fire and give you 10 ways that Jesus draws contrast in this third section after death, all right? So if you have your pens, kind of, stretch your wrists out, crack your knuckles, because we're going to go through quick. Are you ready? The first way that Jesus contrasts the two is by their location, right? I mean, while Lazarus reclines at the table of Abraham, the rich man suffers in Hades. The word that's used here is translated Hades, but it's the place where people suffer. Now, in the Old Testament, this word really meant kind of the place of the dead, but we see because of his suffering that this is a place of eternal judgment. The fires and torment described seem to indicate that this is a permanent place where the guilty will reside. And so the first way they're contrasted and the consequence of their lives is by their eternal location. The second way they're contrasted is by their proximity to glory. In the story, the rich man can see the glory, but he can't experience the glory. I mean, what can be worse than seeing other people experience joy while we're suffering, right? When I was living in San Francisco, I went and did a tour of Alcatraz, the famous island prison. And while I was there, they told a story that I've never forgotten. It was a haunting story. They said that when the prisoners were out on the yard exercising, big exercise space, that on holidays, they could hear people sailing by and laughing. That the laughter of these people on their sailboats would kind of drift over the wind and they could hear it. And I just thought, man, that is brutal, right? You could imagine you're spending years in prison, looking out at a city you wish you could be in, and you hear little wisps of conversation and laughter. as you're in prison. Imagine the effect that it would have on you mentally to be stuck in prison and hear the laughter of families sailing by on vacation. I mean, this is the scene that's depicted, right? That the rich man can see the glory of God. He can see the goodness of God's people redeemed, and yet he can't take a hold of it because of the way he lived his life. The third contrast to be noted is the fact that the rich man is alone while Lazarus is with Abraham. You know, I have to admit that before I prepared this sermon, I never really noticed the fact that the rich man was alone. Have you ever had someone or heard someone gloat that sure they'll go to hell, but they'll have a lot of company? Like it's going to be one big party in hell. This is going to be great. All the best people, the people who like to have fun, they're going to be there with me. And Jesus goes, I got to tell you something. It might not be like that. See, I don't think Jesus is describing exactly what hell is going to be like here, but I think it's worth noting that the image of hell that Jesus portrays here in this parable is one of total loneliness. This dark shadow land where you could walk for 1,000,000 miles in one direction and never run into another soul. I mean, imagine how lonely that would feel. When I was in college, during some of my harder years of college, emotionally, I remember the worst feeling that I ever felt in college was when I would be working on some assignment in the afternoon and I would lose track of time. It'd be like a Friday night when everybody was planning on doing something fun. And I'd go, oh man, it's 7 o'clock. I better go check and see what everyone's doing. And I'd walk out of my dorm room and my dorm would be empty. You know, everybody would have left to do something and I didn't realize that it was happening. I like being alone, but this was different because it was a loneliness that was imposed on me, right? And that's what we see here. We see the rich man totally alone with his brokenness. The fourth way that the two are contrasted is in their physical state. The rich man is burning while Lazarus has water. Now, I don't necessarily subscribe to the kind of Middle Ages image of hell being fire and brimstone and all that. But I think the portrait here is that the man is suffering in the afterlife. While the rich man lived in comfort on earth, he now lives with insatiable pain. And Lazarus, who is plagued with sores, now has access to healing water. His sores are gone, and his water will never run out. The rich man received his blessings on earth, while Lazarus received his blessings in heaven. It's important to note the difference. The fifth way that they're contrasted is that the rich man is aware of Lazarus, while Lazarus seems to be unaware of the man. In other words, Lazarus is at ease. He doesn't have a care in the world. He's not looking across that chasm and seeing people suffering. His heart isn't bleeding. God has made him blissfully unaware of anything else except for his glory. He's no longer concerned with the rich man. Imagine how many times he must have envied the rich man in his life. Imagine how many times he must have seen this man of great wealth and luxury and status pass by him and think, oh, if I could just have a tenth of what this man had. I mean, if I could just have a tenth of the honor, the tenth of the connections, a tenth of the friendships, then I could get new clothes or treatment for my skin. And yet now, it's the rich man who longs to be like Lazarus. Notice how the rich man calls him by name. What do you think that says about the rich man's relationship to Lazarus? I think it means that he knew him. I wonder if Lazarus ever knew that the rich man knew his name. Maybe the rich man knew his name, but still blew him off, still mistreated him. And yet in this moment, when the rich man needs something, he calls out and asks for Lazarus to come. Lazarus was no stranger. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. The rich man couldn't blame it, like he didn't know he was there. He didn't notice him. The rich man knew him and yet still refused to help him. When he gets to the afterlife, however, the story changes. The sixth contrast that Jesus makes is in their memory of their former life. In verse 25, Abraham says, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he's comforted here, and you are in agony." The man is distinctly aware of his former life. You know, I think sometimes when we're worried about going to hell, we kind of like to think that this life will be forgotten. That all our pain and suffering, we might in the afterlife, or people who don't believe in an afterlife, they think, oh, when I'm gone, that I'm not going to remember what happened on earth. And what Jesus is saying here is, no, you will be distinctly aware of what happened on earth, at least if you're the rich man, right? But the poor man seems to sit silent, consumed by the glory that now surrounds him. The rich man is left for eternity to ponder the choices that he's made, while Lazarus basks in the glory of God. Seventh way that these two are contrasted is in their permanent location. In verse 26, Jesus says, and besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, and those who want to go from you to here also cannot. I think this is one of the spookiest and strangest phrases in the whole New Testament. A great chasm has been set in place. When I was in high school, I went on a mission trip to Mexico. And after we had done some work in Mexico, we were coming back and we stopped at the Grand Canyon. And late at night, I left my hotel and I went out to one of the observation decks right on the edge of the canyon. And it was spooky. Because when I stood there alone on the edge of the Grand Canyon, it was so dark out and the hole was so deep that my eyes couldn't fixate on anything in the hole. You know that feeling where it's so dark that your eyes can't adjust? And so there was this deep, dark hole of black. And then the light from the stars or moon kind of hit the other side of the canyon, and I could see the other side of the canyon out on the horizon. And it was a feeling that I still remember to this day because it was so deeply unsettling. This dark space, this great chasm between me and the other side of the Grand Canyon. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that I turned around and I walked very fast back to my hotel. I was like, get me out of this creepy place, all right? The canyon was so deep and dark that light couldn't penetrate it. It was this great chasm. Every time I read this parable, I think of that night. So what does that tell us about eternity? Well, I think it tells us this, and we got to pay attention, right, when Jesus talks. I think it tells us that when we die, there's no turning back. There's no way to change our minds. There's no way to negotiate a better deal, that we have exactly one life to make our decision. I remember talking to a non-Christian who said to me, Thomas, I don't think it's fair that God gives us 60, 70, 80, 100 years on earth to make a decision for eternity. And I said, well, then why don't you choose to follow him right now and you can be done with it? No, I don't want to do that. Here's the thing, you guys. Even if we had an eternity to make a decision, if we aren't willing to submit, we're not willing to submit. If we're willing to submit, we can do it now. If you want to follow Jesus, if you want to experience the life he has to offer, do it now. There's no turning back. For when we die, a great chasm will separate those who experience life from those who experience death. Jesus has warned us, and now you and I cannot say that we haven't been told. The eighth way that Jesus contrasts these two is by their concern for their loved ones. When Lazarus is unaware and unconcerned for the people back on earth, the rich man is afraid for his family. In other words, not only does he suffer the agony of his own despair, he suffers the agony of being afraid for his family. My family's going to end up like me. They're going to suffer like me. While the rich man worries, Lazarus is settled. When we rest in God's promises, we can be confident that he's going to take care of our loved ones. When we depend on our own strength, we have no control over the destinies of those around us. The ninth way that they're contrasted is in their personal peace. In verse 30, the rich man begs Abraham for another chance, but Lazarus rests in peace. The rich man says, but if someone from the dead would just go to them, then they will repent. He's hoping that somehow someone would return and warn his brothers. But his time of influence has passed. At this point, Lazarus is feasting with Abraham without a care in the world, but the rich man is left in a state of uncertainty. He's hoping for another chance, but none will come. The 10th and final way that these two are contrasted is that the rich man tries to intercede on his brother's behalf, but Lazarus rests in God's promises. In a profound and poignant observation, Abraham says in verse 31, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. I think sometimes we think, if Jesus could just walk into this room and do a miracle, then I would believe, right? If I could just see one thing that his people got to see, then I would believe. How could anyone doubt? And yet over and over again in the New Testament, we see people doubt. I mean, even after Jesus has been raised from the dead, when he's standing on the mountain in the region of Galilee, right before he ascends, it says that some of the people who were following him saw him and still doubted. There are people that heard his teaching and said, that's a hard teaching. I've got to leave. There's this sense that if I could just see an act of power, and Jesus goes, no, it's not as simple as that. I know you want that, but even if I did that, you still might not believe. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to whether or not you're willing to submit. Whether or not you're willing to accept him as your Lord. And if you're willing to submit, you're exposed to the kingdom. If you're not, then you're going to become your own God, and you will be responsible for your eternity. Jesus is basically saying to the Pharisees, you claim to honor the prophets, but if you really understood them, you would recognize me for who I am. But since you don't understand the prophets, then even my death and resurrection won't convince you. The band's going to come up now. And as they do, I want to take a moment to highlight what I think Jesus is really getting at with this parable. And that's this. See, all sorts of lessons can be drawn from this parable. I could preach 5 different sermons on this one parable. We could talk about the rich and the poor. We could talk about life after death. We could talk about heaven and hell. We could talk about evangelism. But I think the most important point from this parable is this: that you have exactly one life to decide who will be your God. You have one life. And who you choose will have eternal consequences. Whether you like it or not, that's what is the truth. The truth of God has been laid plainly before us, even more so now with Jesus' death and resurrection. So don't take these for granted. Don't put it off. Don't assume that you'll do it next week. The harsh reality that the rich man had to face, and that we will have to face forever, is that he wasted his life on frivolous living, and that the consequences of his decisions today echoed in eternity. He overlooked the poor and ignored the needs of his neighbor, and because of that, he missed out on the heart of God. He didn't embrace the grace that was freely available to him. And the consequence of that decision was permanent separation from the one who gives life. And so I want to challenge everyone today to think about who you are in this story. Are you letting your life pass by without cares in the world? Are you enjoying your sumptuous frivolity, or are you being faithful to the God who loves you? Are you trusting in your wealth or your status or your relationships to save you, or have you placed your faith in Christ? Are you the rich man, or are you Lazarus? For if you've chosen your path, you will be faced with serious consequences. An eternity of isolation and agony, where the laughter of those who sit and eat at the banquet of God will drift over the air and the winds into your ears, crossing your path, only to remind you of what could have been and what now will never be. So if you have ears to hear, listen now. Follow Jesus today. Embrace God's call in your life. Let go of control and let Jesus take you to his side. Let's pray. Lord, help us to learn from your parable that you are the only true source of life, that you are the only true source of hope in a world that promises us everything and yet leaves us empty. Father, we can't take it with us. Father, help us to trust you.